Thanks, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Naomi Smith-Evans. I'm Executive Director at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, and I'm excited to be here with you all for week 3 of Youth Justice Action Month and our webinar today hosted by the National Juvenile Justice Network in partnership with the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. Before we get started, I just wanted to let folks know that we know that the content that we're going to be covering today is information that may be triggering to some attendees, particularly those with system experience. So if you need support at any time, Maggie Gallen, a clinical therapist, is on the line with us. Feel free to reach out to her in the comment section or message one of us to get connected. So thank you to everyone for being here with us today. Today, we're going to be joined by experts on 3 key issue areas in youth justice. First, experts on harms of institutionalization of system-involved youth. We're joined by Bobby Taylor, consultant, program and project research, and Sarah Sullivan, senior director for programs with Think of Us. Think of Us operates as a research and development lab for child welfare, transforming the system so that people with lived experience are at the center of designing, imagining, and building. They recently released a report, Away from Home, which provides an in-depth report on the experiences and perspectives of young people who have recently lived in institutional placements in foster care. We're also joined with experts on harm on for-profit placements. Andrea Fannin, Senior Case Advocate Fellow for Alabama Disability Advocacy Program Investigation and Monitoring Team, is here with us today. In her role with the Protection and Advocacy Organization, she has led the investigation of for-profit facilities in Alabama, including Sequel, which many of us on this call are familiar with, Sequel Youth and Family Services. She's also played a lead role in the development of the National Disability Rights Network report on the harms of for-profit facilities, which was released last week. It's a very powerful report. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I definitely encourage you to do that. Jasmine Ariana is the campaign coordinator with the We Warned Them campaign. Jasmine is a human rights activist and a survivor of child and institutional abuse. Her advocacy journey for at-risk youth started with the successful shutdown of Freedom Village USA's move to South Carolina in 2021. She authored NYRA's open letter demanding to close abusive behavior modification facilities during COVID-19. Right before its publication, Cornelius Fredericks died by being restrained. It's a very timely and powerful and important topic that Jasmine and Andrea and all of our presenters are working on today. We're also joined by experts on closing youth prisons. Gladys Carrion is a senior fellow at the Columbia Justice Lab and co-chair of the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice, a coalition of over 65 current and former system leaders committed to ending the punitive youth prison, reducing the carceral footprint, and reimagining how to serve and support justice-involved youth and impacted communities. As a former New York State and New York City Commissioner for Child Welfare, Juvenile Justice, and the Early Care and Education System in New York, she has years of experience working in communities of color that are under-resourced and subject to over-surveillance to channel resources and services. Ashanti Jones is the campaign manager of the 150 Years is Enough campaign, housed at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Ashanti's life experiences with the New Jersey foster system challenges her MSW from Columbia University, and her experience as an administrative social worker are the foundation for her work with families, organizations, and communities of color concerning issues of access and equity. Ashanti's journey has included work with reentering citizens, children, and adults with developmental disabilities, strategic planning, education advocacy, as well as developing programs to strengthen families and better communities. Ashanti is an emerging social work professional with a goal of empowering underserved communities to be the strongest advocates for change they deserve to see. I appreciate all of our presenters being here, all of our attendees, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to you all. Thank you.
So Bobby and Sarah with Think of Us are going to kick us off and talk about the harms and institutional placements. I don't know if you are able to share your slides. Perfect.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Sullivan from Think of Us. Thank you so much for having us today. And from our team, it's myself and my colleague, Bobby Taylor. And we're going to share a little bit about our work looking at institutionalization within foster care. And we recently did a project that got published in July known as Away from Home, which documented young people's experiences in foster care in institutions. And we're going to share a little bit about what we learned as well as where we go from here. So briefly, just to ground us, for those who are new to this particular issue within child welfare. So institutional placements in foster care are out-of-home placements where we put young people not with family, but in staff-run institutions. About 40,000 foster youth a year live in these placements, which represents about 10% of the overall foster care population. But in some specific states, it can be up to 30% of foster youth that are in institutions. And these placements disproportionately impact Black youth, youth of color, disabled youth, and also parenting and pregnant young people. And due to the events of 2020, including, calls to reckon with longstanding institutional racism and COVID-19 spreading more rapidly through institutions of all kinds, and also specifically the death of Cornelius Fredericks, who was a 16-year-old Black teenager in a Michigan group home who died at the hands of staff. There was a growing movement throughout 2020 calling to really re-examine child welfare's policy around institutionalization. But what really felt like was missing, even though there's kind of been decades of research around some of the harms of institutionalization, what felt like a gap was really understanding young people's specific experiences, their mental models, their beliefs around group homes and congregate care. And so we Think of Us stepped in to really try to fill this gap in the scientific literature by doing a qualitative study with 78 young people. And so Think of Us went on a journey with 7 researchers. Bobby and I are 2 of that team of 7 people to really try to understand the experiences of 78 young people who were foster youth who'd been recently institutionalized. Of our team of 7 researchers, 3 of the team of 7 had lived experience in foster care, and 2 had lived experience in group homes in foster care specifically. And we talked to 78 young people who were ages 18 to 25 to really try to understand what were their experiences, what did they think about reforming or ending group homes, and to really advise on where the ecosystem should go from here. Sorry. Can I go back? I want to, as a part of this work, we talk to young people in an interview-like setting, but we also wanted to really understand what were some of the emotions and that people were felt during their time in institutions. So we gave creative prompts where we invited young people to submit poems and art and photographs to elicit some of what their experiences were really like. All of what we found is in a really long paper that we published as a book this July, known as Way From Home. And I invite you to dig into that if you want to read all of what we found. But I really just want to ground you in young people's words and stories in the short time that we have together. So what I'm going to do is just present a few of those, or 5 of those artistic expressions that we got. So you can kind of get a sense of what we were hearing, and I'll kind of elucidate some of the themes that we found when I present on those. So here's a young person who submitted a photograph to a prompt that said, send us a photograph of something that reminds you of your time in an institution in foster care. And here you can see the person said, I received this plush toy the night I went into foster care, which was January 8th, 2009. It was a long, anxiety-ridden, lonely night on the twin mattress in the foster care shelter. It was cold. The mattress crinkled every time I moved since it had a plastic barrier under the fitted sheet, which I assumed was to ensure that if someone peed themselves, it wouldn't soak on the mattress. And I could hear the staff talking. All I had was the plush toy, some extra clean underwear, and the clothes I came in with. This photograph kind of highlights a couple of themes that emerged from this work, which is one is that young people had a very clear memory often of when they entered the institution, and very often would say the specific date they entered, as in the case of this person. Which really struck us is that even though what might seem like a routine event to a social worker or a staff person of a young person entering institution was actually a very significant life event of the young person. And other people would talk about their anniversary date of the date they went into the institution, and kind of showing that this kind of had the patterning of a traumatic event in the way that we think of other traumatic events. This is a poem that we received from a young person called Normal, and I'll read it to you. It says, "What is normal? Is it a feeling, perhaps an emotion? Whatever it is, I will never know. Is it a prescription? What aisle is it at the grocery store? Is it something I can even afford? Wherever would I find it? What does it smell like? Can you touch it? Perhaps it tastes good, but how would I know if I found it? What is normal?" And this person said, "I was an LGBTQ youth in placements that were not accepting. That's why I wrote this poem." And this poem really highlights a couple of big themes we found in this work, which was one was really around normalcy, or really the lack of normalcy, that foster youth who were in institutionalized settings that reported to us that they could not participate in the standard activities that teenagers and adolescents participate in, whether it's having a job or going to birthday parties or trick-or-treating or going to prom or going on dates, that these were often experiences that because they were institutionalized, they were not allowed to participate in. And of course, the caption also reveals another theme that we found, which is that LGBTQ youth and other racial minority groups felt discriminated and experienced discrimination while institutionalized. And this caption speaks to that. Next, this is a piece of artwork that someone submitted to the prompt of describing what their time in an institution was like. And the caption reads, "I think of what I drew as a piece that symbolizes us, the kids in foster care, feeling trapped. I do not want to fail in my life, and I feel trapped in the fear of getting old. I also think it shows how the adults are turned on one another, but there is these children inside them trying to get out. You see almost prisoner-like setting because being in the system can feel like a prison or a life sentence." And this speaks to a theme that really was very prominent throughout this work, which was that foster youth described prison-like settings, often using the vocabulary of prison to describe foster care institutional placements, which included things like talking about jail mail or having to do their time or simply comparing it to prison, or describing relationships that were highly scrutinized into who they could call and how they could call, and staff would be on the phone when they would call and the times of day that they could call. And what was really, really strong for us was this big theme around young people compared their time in institutional placements in foster care to prison. Oftentimes the comparison was better than prison, but still their go-to comparison was to compare foster care institutions to prison. Next, I'm going to show you another piece of art, and I want to emphasize what was shared at the beginning, which is a trigger warning that we know some of this material is intense, and this next image is intense. So this was a drawing that, again, a young person submitted to the prompt of describe your time in an institutional placement. And you can see the caption that they wrote on the side, which is the ugly truth of the system.
Oh my God.
Just let that for a second. I know that is a lot. Then lastly, I'll share this photograph that someone shared to the prompt of just send a photograph of a time that reminds you of being in an institution in foster care. And someone sent this photo and they said, this was jail mail when I was in the group homes, jail, or treatment facilities. For a very long time, I was the only one without mail coming in. It meant so much to other people to receive mail. I still love them. I still have the mail to this day and reflect on written messages from time to time. So those are some artifacts I wanted to show you just to ground you in the kind of stories and kind of material that we heard. And now I'm going to pass it off to Bobby, who was a researcher on the project, to share some of her story and also some of the big picture conclusions.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Bobby Taylor, and it's a pleasure to be in community with you all today. I, again, was a researcher on Away from Home, but I also have lived experience in care. And so I'm going to share a little bit about my story and then how that ties into what we found in the Away from Home study. So I entered care actually through juvenile justice, and my first setting was a juvenile detention center at the age of 12. And so from 12 to 19, I went from placement to placement to placement and had a few sprinkles of failed attempts to reunify at home. It wasn't until much later that the system found out that they were actually sending me home to my abuser. And from that day forward, I was considered a foster youth. And I remember thinking, foster care was going to be my saving grace and my chance at normalcy, but that wasn't the case. It was actually much, much harder to find me a placement as an older foster youth. So eventually, I knew that finding a foster home was going to be a long shot, and I would run away because I was so tired of being deprived of my freedom and my normalcy and, quite frankly, my childhood. And so fast forward, I'm 17. I'm at the highest level of care that Nebraska has to offer at the time. And the opportunity to run away presents itself. And so I did. 6 months later, I was arrested and taken to the county. And for the next 6 months after that, I would spend my time in the county jail. And unfortunately, there wasn't one aspect of that facility that I had not experienced through my journey in the youth system. And I remember thinking, serving some time in the county, how ironic is it that the very system that they said they were trying to prevent me from going into was actually the system that they were conditioning me for since the first day I entered care at 12 years old. So, I had been put in juvenile justice settings, foster, congregate care, group home settings, and now the adult system. And to be honest, there wasn't much of a difference there. I ended my journey in a traditional foster home 2 weeks before I aged out. And that was the end of my journey. So as a researcher from away from home, I really resonated with all of the stories that were elevated. And to spare time for everyone else, I'll only highlight a few of the findings that we had from the institutional placements that youth lifted up. So the first that I'll lift up is, institutional placements were carceral. And I think Sarah kind of touched on those points around the language, the environment, the setting in which young people were placed into were actually comparable to prisons and jails for adults. The second that I will highlight is that they were punitive. A lot of young people felt like they were being punished for being in a group home, but they really didn't have a reason to be punished, right? They were foster youth. And so it was no fault of their own to be there, but they were still treated as if they were troubled youth and they needed to be fixed. And the last is that they were traumatic and unfit for healthy child and adolescent development. Through the stories lifted by so many young people, they experienced sexual assault, they experienced physical abuse, they experienced emotional abuse and verbal abuse. And so these are detrimental to adolescent development, and it doesn't provide the conditions that young people need to heal so that they can thrive in life. And I encourage you all to read the report to kind of go over the other findings that we found, but I will pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Bobby. So now we'll just spend a few minutes on what some of the recommendations that emerged from Away from Home. And these are really rooted in what young people with lived experience were telling us about a different world that they'd like to see. And so I'll speak a little bit now to some of these recommendations. The first is that our team emerged after hearing, frankly, damning story after damning story that was also aligned with much of the quantitative research out there. We really emerged transformed as a team with the recommendation to eliminate institutions. One really interesting thing I want to point out is that when we talk to young people about what they wanted to see in a different world, what we found is that many young people, really the majority of young people, had a really deep mental model that said that institutions exist because there's literally nowhere else to go, which is to say that when we talk to young people about a different world, they were really concerned that if we eliminate institutions, it would mean more young people would be on the streets or in jail. And young people were very clear with us that the alternatives can't be homelessness or jail. We actually have to solve the upstream problems that created the conditions for group homes to begin with. And so a lot of where we focused our attention in our recommendations and our work as Think of Us moving forward is how do we create a different conditions and solve the upstream problems so that we eliminate the need and the reasons that group homes existed in the first place. And so what that really looks like for us is we can't replace institutions with another institution by a different name, and we can't get rid of institutions and allow homelessness and jail to be the answer. We have to solve the upstream problems. And so if you kind of, I'll go in order. If you look at number 3, is that the first thing is we really have to avoid foster youth, avoid entering care whenever possible. As we know, up to 40% of foster youth who end up in care don't end up for a true abuse or neglect issue, but rather other kinds of issues like really reasons of poverty. And we can't let foster youth enter the system for these reasons and solve those poverty issues rather than taking young people away and out of their communities. So focusing on prevention. And next, when there is a true abuse or neglect issue and foster care really does seem to be the right choice, then we need to have the first placement be with kin or somebody that young people already know. Interestingly, every foster youth or former foster youth we talk to as a part of Away From Home, we ask them, did you have someone else you wanted to be living with instead of being in an institution? And everyone except for 2 people said yes. And so we'd ask them about those people. Why weren't you placed with that person? And in every incident, there was some sort of bureaucratic or other reason that was preventing that placement from happening. So we really need to work to break down those bureaucratic and other barriers to help get youth placed with the people that are in their lives who love them and support them. Some of these things look like expanding the legal definition of kin so that your former stepmother is an option, and also expediting licensing and support for kinship families. So we're not taking a year or 18 months to get grandma licensed to be able to provide you the services that you need, and other supports that would help get young people meaningfully connected with kin. And then next, number 5 is when kinship, for whatever reason, truly isn't an option. We believe that placing young people with foster families who are strangers should really be the last resort of the foster family system. That placing you with strangers is really the last resort. And when that's the best option, or that's the only viable option, that we're recruiting foster families that are gonna be a good fit for foster youth. So this looks like recruiting families in the same neighborhood that youth live in and are the same school district, who speak the same language and practice a similar faith, or in all cases are affirming all aspects of youth's identities. So we really see that as, in reforming those issues in the foster family system, as kind of the last stop on the path. And critical to getting there, and this may seem silly that we don't already do this, but is to talk to youth about where they want to live and do what we can to make those placements possible. Like I said, every young person we talked to actually had somewhere they wanted to be living instead of an institution, but there was some bureaucratic or other barrier getting in the way. So let's actually talk to young people about where they want to live and make that a practice and do what we can to make those placements viable options. And then I'll just mention that as institutions are phased out, we really need to center young people in the process of redesigning the new system. And this may look like, as young people are stuck in the gap as institutions are phased out, a 17-and-a-half-year-old who would prefer to stay in an institution instead of 6 months or 3 months with the foster family, as Bobby mentioned, her 2 weeks before aging out. We really want to affirm and support young people who are kind of stuck in the middle as the system transforms. So these are kind of the recommendations that Think of Us is now building on to build a world without institutions and foster care. And I will just say that A Sense Away from Home published in July, we've seen really tremendous forward progress from states who have stepped forward to either commit to ending institutional placements or radically reducing them. And so we're really excited about the progress that we see. And one of the things on our mind will be this fall, as the Family First Act becomes more fully implemented, there'll be an opportunity to further commit to the spirit of that law to make sure we really are centering families and deprioritizing institutions. And we'll probably be looking for our colleagues across ecosystems to help support us in making sure that becomes a reality. And lastly, I'll just invite you, if you'd like to learn more, to check out our Away from Home website and landing page, where you can read the whole report or buy the book, or we have a video recording of our presentation where you can kind of hear what we just talked about with a little more expanded view. And with that, I'll pass it back. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Bobby, and thank you, Sarah, so much for sharing the report and sharing how these systems, both child welfare and youth justice, really impact young people. And what's interesting about the report, right, is we often, as professionals who work in the youth justice space, think of sort of foster care as the system that really supports young people and youth justice as one that punishes. But when you talk to young people who've been through the system, it's clear that the institutions that serve both child welfare and youth justice children feel like prisons to young people. And so that's one of the really compelling findings of the report that we thank you for sharing. So we're going to sort of shift as we think about the system to focusing on campaigns that are really rallied around for-profit facilities where we know a lot of harms and traumas have been committed, and where a lot of current momentum is after the death of Cornelius Fredericks. So Andrea, we'll actually start with you, and if you want to share a little bit about the work that you've been doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I am a senior case advocate with the Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Program, or ADAP. We are the federally mandated protection advocacy agency for people with disabilities in the state of Alabama. And today I'm briefly going to share with you some of the work that we've recently done in our state's residential facilities for youth, and share some of our children's stories with you. I think our work really highlights how children in these residential facilities, they're vulnerable to conditions that pose a direct threat to their health and safety, and why we really need to focus on funding care and supports in the community rather than relying heavily on these residential facilities. I'm also going to talk today about some of our efforts to reduce the reliance on these residential facilities. And then I'm going to go into a report that was released last week by the National Disability Rights Network. It's on the for-profit youth residential facilities. And if you haven't read it, I urge everyone to read it. I think it's very powerful. And so I'll go ahead and get started. In 2020, we really focused on a particular provider. A lot of you on this call may be familiar with them, Sequel Youth and Family Services. They operate 4 residential facilities that provide intensive mental health treatment for youth ages 11 to 19 in our state. So since 2017, we've conducted 9 monitoring visits, 2 systemic investigations, and numerous individual investigations involving Sequel. Our findings have identified egregious and far-reaching patterns of abuse, neglect, mistreatment, accounts of substantiated physical and sexual abuse by staff, restraints with injuries, negligence, and the enforcement of traumatizing practices. So in 2020, we really continued that work, and we went to all 4 facilities, and we met with over 100 residents at the facilities. We issued a monitoring report in July of 2020, and then after that, we met with our state's officials regarding possible corrective actions. But today, all 4 of these facilities remain open and licensed by the state of Alabama. So here's another Warning, the following slides contain content that may include some graphic pictures and references to topics such as physical abuse, violence, self-harm, sexual abuse. So CEQAL says that the physical and emotional health of our students is paramount, and a physically and emotionally safe environment promotes student learning. Well, let's contrast that to what we found when we were in the facilities. I don't feel safe. 4 words repeatedly expressed by the children locked away in these programs. Here we have a 14-year-old boy who showed us fresh injuries while we were talking to him. He shared how staff had grabbed him from the floor and slammed his head against a wall the previous night. We were able to confirm his story, and this incident and many others like it confirmed the pervasive toxic culture of these programs. Here we have a 15-year-old boy who was brutally beaten and hospitalized not once, but twice, all within the matter of a few days. He suffered multiple physical attacks at the hands of staff and his peers, and he tried to hang himself in the bathroom after being returned to the same facility after each of the incidents. We met with another 15-year-old boy who cut himself with a broken window frame and smeared his blood on his bedroom window as a means for coping with being locked up at the facility. Children referred to CEQAL as a jail, being locked up, and they spoke about being placed in SEG. At one of the facilities, boys were forced to urinate in a corner on the floor in SEG because staff would not let them out to go to the bathroom. Other boys were shackled and forced to walk from SEG to the bathroom in the shackles. Another boy snuck a lighter into SEG and set his mattress on fire while the residents watched as staff stood outside the room and laughed at the boy and delayed letting him out. At 2 of the facilities, girls are placed on what's called group ignorance, which is a practice where a child is physically present in the room but allowed no contact with staff or other residents. So some girls experience this shunning practice for weeks at a time and even up to months at a time. And at another facility, girls are not allowed to call each other by their names. They can only use their initials. Here we have a picture of a child's play area in their bedroom. So the grim reality is that all 4 facilities were found in disrepair. They lack the physical footprint needed to provide adequate space for programming. They're not allowed desks, chairs, or other comforts that you would expect to find in a child's bedroom. They're instead forced to sit on dirty floors and hallways, a practice they and staff call riding the bus or getting on the bus. All 4 CEQAL programs operate in rundown buildings. 2 programs force children to sleep on concrete slabs like the one seen in this picture. These programs are detention-like, both physically and operationally. And let's remember, these are children who have not been adjudicated delinquent, but they've been removed from abusive homes and placed into state care. And then they're placed in these facilities. Here we have a picture of safety hazards that were present. We identified numerous serious environmental hazards, safety hazards. None of the facilities are ligature resistant, despite reports of numerous suicide attempts and numerous self-harming incidents. CEQAL had taken no apparent steps to identify and eliminate these dangers. And then finally, during one of our on-site visits, we observed feces on a child's bedroom floor, smeared on the wall and stuck inside a broken door frame. The program therapist there shared the boy's horrific history of sexual abuse and how ill-equipped CEQAL was to provide the level of care this young boy needed. And by the way, staff there called this boy Shitty. That was the name they used for him. So I just want to share with you a few of their own words. about their experience living in these facilities. One boy told me, "I don't feel like nobody here helps me except myself." Another boy said that staff often said things like, "You ain't worth shit. You ain't never gonna be nothing." Another boy said if he could fix anything, he would fix people not being slammed by staff. And then over and over again, girls told me they treat us like dogs. They treat us like dogs. So there's 10 different providers like Sequel that operate residential treatment facilities at 16 different locations in Alabama. And many children in state care, they're being sent to these programs and forgotten. They're growing up in the facilities, going from one program to another, when they could be served in the community with the appropriate supports and services. So again, I mentioned before, we issued a report. We met with state officials regarding corrective action, but yet today, all 4 facilities remain open. So we've kind of had to think creatively about how do we help these children when our state welfare agency, child welfare agency, has not been responsive. So we have gone around and we have made presentations to guardians ad litem, to the state juvenile judges, to the juvenile probation officers, all about the importance of going to visit your children in the facilities, seeing where they're living, what the conditions are really like, listening to the children. Many of these children don't know who their guardian ad litem is. They've never heard of them. We repeatedly hear they just want to talk to their judge and tell them what's going on, but they're not given that opportunity. So we've been doing that. We've also this summer, our legal team in partnership with Children's Rights and Southern Poverty filed a class action lawsuit against our state child welfare agency for Olmstead violations, in the hopes that this will force the state to really focus on providing the long needed funding and resources for community supports and services. And then we've also been working closely with the National Disability Rights Network to put out this report that was released last week. It's called Desperation Without Dignity. And in the report, we really talk about the history of the for-profit residential treatment industry. We talk about common troubling issues, a lot of which we've touched on here already. The private funding structure of these organizations, alternatives to residential placement, and there's a number of recommendations that are on the federal level, the state level, and the local level. So I really urge everyone to take a look at that report. Like I said, I think we touched on a lot of the common troubling issues, but physical abuse, unlawful restraint and seclusion, emotional and verbal abuse, over medication, misuse of medication, the lack of appropriate mental health treatment, which is the reason a lot of these children, most of these children are placed in these facilities in the first place. Inadequate medical care, lack of adequate educational services.
Health services is a big one. Like I think highlighting
Dangerous and filthy living environment.
they meet criteria for.
And then
I think you're, yeah, if you could mute yourself, I've been trying to mute you as well.
The report also makes a lot of recommendations, which I won't go into all of them at this moment, but there's recommend federal legislation regarding licensing of these facilities, legislation on the use of restraint and seclusion, funding for community-based placements and supports, the DOJ's enforcement of the Olmstead decision to increase the availability of community-based mental health care, and a number of state level actions. And really all of these need to be done, focused on at the same time instead of piecemeal. But that's, I think I will turn it over now. Thank you.
Yeah, as everyone said in the comments, such egregious violations at Sequel and other private facilities. And so really grateful for the report that you're doing to expose those issues, and also the national report's recommendations on both local, state, and federal levels. I'm super excited to now yield the floor to Jasmine. She's with the We Warn Them campaign, and they've been doing fantastic work calling on the end of for-profit placements in the troubled teen industry. So Jasmine, are you able to turn on your screen?
Yes, one second. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I do have my little one in the background. He's our guest speaker as well. So apologies if it's a little bit distracting. Let me get my screen shared here.
And of course, if you don't want to turn on your camera for your little one, we understand. Just want to make sure you have the floor when you're ready.
Okay, here we go. Sorry, one second. Okay, so hi, my name is Jasmine Ariana. I'm a survivor of child and institutional abuse. These are a couple of the organizations that I actually work with. In 2010, at the age of 14, I was sent away to cover up abuse that I had endured since a very young age. I was sent from California to upstate New York to an unregulated program called Freedom Village USA. At Freedom Village USA, many of us experienced brainwashing, grooming, maltreatment, child labor, cruel and unusual punishments, human rights violations, neglect, exploitation, as well as physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Freedom Village USA was a clear case of the abuse of religious exemptions that is happening nationwide. In 2017, I founded the Freedom Village Experience as a safe space for survivors to talk about their experiences without censorship. In 2019, Freedom Village USA announced they were moving their operations to Sunset, South Carolina. We immediately mobilized. Liz, a member of the Freedom Village Experience, lived in South Carolina at the time and was able to get the permission from the fire chief to hold a meet and greet with the community at the fire hall. Shortly after the meet and greet, their partners and the administrators of Freedom Village pulled out. After never having our experiences validated, we cannot express the feeling that we felt when the community of South Carolina stood with us and helped us prevent them from opening up in South Carolina. We thought Freedom Village USA was an isolated experience at the time until we met some survivors from similar programs. That's when we learned of the troubled teen industry, or TTI. In May of 2020, NYRA, the National Youth Rights Association, published our letter demanding to close the abusive behavior modification programs during COVID-19. So what is the troubled teen industry? The TTI is made up of unregulated private and for-profit programs that subject youth to abuse, neglect, and exploitation, making it a multi-billion-dollar industry. These programs label themselves as religious, wilderness, or therapeutic. They claim to fix your child's behavior, or that they can cure their addictions or traumas. Historically, residential boarding schools originated from the forced cultural assimilation of indigenous peoples. So what are the problems? Many, I'm so sorry, excuse me. Alex, stop. Alex, stop, honey. Stop, Sander, shut it, baby, thank you. I'm so sorry about that. Many youth in these programs experience human rights violations, such as inequity, abuse, neglect, exploitation, seclusion and restraint, conversion therapy, cruel and unusual punishment, abuse of transport services, and religious exemptions. It is also more likely that youth in residential placement have experienced trauma prior to being sent away. Abusive transportation services for youth being taken to TTI facilities are essentially kidnappers for hire, except the people hiring them are the parents themselves. Transport services are used to transport youth to these facilities by abruptly waking them up in the middle of the night, using threats, physical force, and intimidation to get them to comply. Youth are not told what is happening or where they are being taken. It is an extremely traumatic experience. Seclusion and restraint of youth can be traumatizing as well as deadly. Upon arrival, youth are cut off from the real world with no access to phones, internet, or current news, as well as friends, families, advocates, healthcare professionals, and mandated reporters. Physical restraint is a personal restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of an individual to move his or her torso, arms, legs, or head freely. It is a hold. There's also chemical and mechanical restraint. Please check out the amazing work of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, founded by Guy Steffens. A link to his website should be in the chat. On May 1st of 2020, which many of us know Cornelius' story, he died from being restrained by 6 staff members for 12 minutes at Lakeside Academy in Kalamazoo, Michigan. His last words were, "I can't breathe. He should still be alive." Inequity, marginalized youth are especially impacted by experiences in the TTI, as certain demographics may be subjected to especially inhumane treatment that solely stems from discrimination. And the experiences of marginalized groups, BIPOC youth are subjected to blatant racism, discrimination, prevented from practicing their cultural traditions. They receive harsher punishments, malignant neglect, and forced assimilation and brainwashing. LGBTQIA+ youth are subjected to conversion therapy, a disproven method used to attempt to change another individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Disabled youth lack the adequate medical care, resources, and accommodations, which results in various ADA violations. I apologize. Youth in these programs experience abuse and neglect because staff are not required background checks, as well as are untrained and do not have the credentials to ensure youth are safe from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Cruel and unusual punishments can vary. Here are some of them: humiliation, attack therapy, bribing students into fight clubs, withholding medical attention, denying access to food, force feeding, stress positions, horse trough therapy, student-on-student restraint, being chained, isolation, and solitary confinement. The exploitation, I apologize. The exploitation of religious exemptions happens because churches and ministries are allowed to open up these programs without ever reporting their existence to the state. This means that their operation is completely underground, which makes them a breeding ground for corruption. Many youth leave these programs with an added layer of complex PTSD resulting from chronic trauma. So what are the solutions? The solutions are to end seclusion and restraint, end transport services, end religious exemptions in TTI programs, end conversion therapy, end human rights violations, a nationwide YRP task force, which I will get more into in a second, and enforce state oversight and enact federal oversight. So the YRP task force is a youth residential placement task force. In 2018, David Hess died at the Wordworth's facility following a fight with staffers who accused him of stealing an iPod. They went into his room to search for it. During the confrontation that followed, 3 staffers restrained Hess, who grew agitated as they flipped over his bed and tossed his furniture around. According to a report on the incident by the State Department of Human Services, one held his legs while another repeatedly punched his ribs, the report said. At one point, Hess began gasping for breath, saying, "Get off me, I can't breathe." The YRP task force was created in response to his death, and we believe a nationwide task force, regardless of if legislation is in place or not, should be continuous to ensure youth rights are being protected in institutional and congregate settings. Sorry, I kind of lost where I'm at for a second. So about the We Warn Them campaign. The Wwt campaign was created in response to the historical lack of action taken by our elected officials to protect at-risk youth from institutional abuse. On April 20th of 2005, Congressman George Miller introduced HR 1738, End Institutional Abuse Against Children's Act, into the US House of Representatives in response to the deaths and maltreatment of at-risk youth in residential care. It was never enacted. In 2008, the Government Accountability Office, also known as the GAO, conducted a report and presented findings in a congressional hearing of the abusive practices in the TTI. The GAO found that youth in residential treatment facilities experience maltreatment, including but not limited to physical abuse, sexual assault, neglect, as well as medical neglect, and civil and human rights violations. Due to the lack of media attention and public outcry, Congress has failed to implement the critical oversight necessary to protect youth from institutional abuse. The We Warn Them campaign aims to change this through collective efforts with you and our community partners. Our mission is to inspire communities nationwide to urge their elected officials to implement systematic change to protect at-risk youth. Our vision is a world without institutional abuse. And our values, we are committed to diversity, equity and inclusion, embracing differences, as well as amplifying the voices of the marginalized. Our campaign calls to action are for the Department of Justice to investigate civil rights violations, for Congress to hold the TTI accountable, as well as ensure effective policy solutions, for the GAO to conduct a new study on the abuse, neglect, and exploitation in TTI programs, and lastly, state and federal oversight. On our website, wewarnthem.org, we actually have a toolkit that can help guide you on how to be an effective advocate, contact your elected officials, and take action. Youth and TTI programs have been dying for decades from abuse and neglect. The last 3 youth who have died in programs have been Black youth. Cornelius Fredericks, Naomi Woods, and Krista Simmons should still be alive. If you would like to learn more, please visit our website or contact us at wewarnthem@gmail.com. Thank you so much to Allison for this opportunity to speak and for NJJN's allyship. It means the world. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. And I love all the little ones joining us. If only briefly, it really reminds us of why we do this work. So special shout out to your little ones. So unfortunately, Gladys Carrion had a family emergency, not able to join us. But we are thrilled to also have Ashanti Jones, who has been leading the effort to close youth prisons on the local level in New Jersey. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the larger No Kids in Prison movement, just so folks can check it out. Unfortunately, like I said, Gladys can't share more about it, but we do have the wonderful Ashanti who's going to share about the local work. So I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just briefly share and talk through our presentation. Just one moment. Okay, great. So I'm Ashanti Jones. I am the 150 Years is Enough campaign manager for the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And our main question, it just talks about what comes after youth closure. And so the 150 Years is Enough campaign is a campaign that we started in 2017 on the 150th anniversary of the oldest youth prison in New Jersey. So the Institute, along with 50 partner organizations, launched this campaign in response to the entirely punitive, wasteful system that unfortunately impacts Black and Brown youth disproportionately in New Jersey. And so we have been incarcerating young people for 154 years now, and we're not reaping any of the benefits that the carceral system has said we were supposed to. Our young people are recidivating. They're going back into jails and prisons within 3 years. Upwards of 70% of young people are doing that. We also see that young people are worse off, especially when they have mental health issues, because they're not being appropriately treated while they're in care. And then we're also seeing young people coming back into their communities without the resources to make their reentry successful. And so the campaign really seeks to transform the overall system by closing youth prisons, right? We don't need youth prisons. What we need are community-based continuums that support young people in whatever ways that they need it without being punitive in our response to youth behavior. And understanding that there are some youth who may commit egregious crimes, who may need secure facilities. One of the issues with New Jersey's system is that our prisons are so far away from where young people are living, where their families are. And so that makes it increasingly difficult for us to build up their protective factors, right? To loop family into care, to help young people transition correctly because they're so far away. And so understanding that, what we advocate for is no more new facilities, right? There were a few, especially at the start of this campaign, there were a few proposals from the state to build new facilities. And unfortunately, one of those was right across the street from a high school, which was uniquely positioned right next to a cemetery. And so like when you have those kind of images and you're projecting that at Black and brown youth, it's telling them something. Well, even if that message isn't explicit, it's telling them something. And so this campaign, actually, its inaugural event was a rally to stop that campaign, to stop that building. And it was successful, right? And so we don't want any new buildings, but we do understand there are some structures that do exist that are blighted or not in use that can be repurposed to look like a facility that's just a little bit more closer to home. So we're not looking for anything that looks like a jail, just something secure that is in young people's communities where they come from. We also advocate for the state to invest in the creation of an interconnected community-based system of care. And we've been hosting listening and visioning sessions all over New Jersey for the past 4 years to get a sense of what that interconnected system of care can look like. And we've gotten some really great ideas, right? And so another thing that we've done is connect our community engagement strategies. We are not the only organization in New Jersey or the only people in New Jersey who feel that youth incarceration is an egregious act. And so we've partnered with those organizations to kind of complement each other, to talk about what are the ways we can divest from incarceration and back into the communities where people come from. We also are focusing on implementing restorative and transformative justice practices because we understand that those things work, right? When we're talking about restorative justice, we're talking about the community person to community person relationships, building up those protective factors and those relationships in the community to help people understand where people are coming from, while the transformative justice practices that we advocate for really transform systems, right? How can we make the education system more robust and more secure and more serving of young people who are within it, right? How do we end that school to prison pipeline, right? And so there's some of the things that we focus and work on. Another thing is reinvesting that fund. So we want to divest, but also reinvest in a comprehensive continuum of care. And that continuum of care will support young people no matter where they are in the spectrum. If they need preventative services, if they need, post-reentry services, whatever it is that they need, we want to meet young people along that continuum. And so we want to also make sure that our policies are equitable. Unfortunately, New Jersey is #1 with the most racially divisive youth justice system in the country. And what we see is that young people, it went down a little bit. It was at the beginning of this year, 21 more times likely, but now it's 18.5 times. Black kids are 18.5 times more likely to be locked up in New Jersey than white kids. And this is the highest disparity in the nation. And this is despite the fact that white and Black young people in New Jersey commit the same crimes at similar rates. So when you see, what you see here is you're sending messages to young people about who's worthy and deserving of being considered a kid. And who receives a more punitive measure. And so white kids who enter the New Jersey system are more likely to be diverted, right? To receive services, right? To receive those diversionary program sentences. Unfortunately, Black kids do not share those rates. And they unfortunately are more likely to be sentenced and committed. And then we see that the cost to incarcerate young people is ridiculous. At the beginning of our campaign, the cost was around $285,000 annually to incarcerate a single young person, but it went up in 2019 to $300,000. And now we see at the top of 2021, according to the governor's budget, New Jersey plans to spend $445,503 to incarcerate each child in a state youth prison a year. So we've done some cost analysis about what that looks like, right? $445,000 is almost $500,000. So you can only imagine the kind of work we'd be able to do if we invested that in schools, right? Or if we invested that in mental health education. I'm so sorry, one second. Sorry, forgive me for that. Yes, so $445,000 is the amount of money that we are spending to incarcerate a single child. If we were to spend that kind of money rehabilitating that family, understanding the root causes of why this young person or why young people in general are resorting to crime or criminal activity, we get a better sense of how we can spend this money, right? Our youth justice budget is about $56 million, and very few of those dollars actually go towards rehabilitating kids in a way that promotes smart decarceration. And so what we saw at the top of our campaign, here's just a little bit of a timeline. One of our first actions actually resulted in the announcement of the closure of 2 of our 3 youth prisons in New Jersey. So Jamesburg, which is the youth prison for boys, and the Hayes Girls Prison, which was once a prominent Black academy. Talk about your actual physical school prison pipeline, were announced to be closed by former Governor Chris Christie in New Jersey. Here we are in 2021, and we still don't have any closure dates, right? So like Governor Chris Christie, he announced the closure of those youth prisons, but we unfortunately didn't see any movement on like when and how we can work with the governor's office to get these prisons closed and these young people released back into their communities. And unfortunately, we're still fighting that fight 4 years later. However, along the way, we have gotten some leeway. So in 2018, our new governor, Governor Phil Murphy, he issued an executive order that created a task force for the continued transformation of youth justice in New Jersey. And so that task force ultimately didn't undo the previous governor's decision, but also didn't really do much to close youth prisons. We talked, what the task force basically said is that we'll think about not building any new structures and repurposing those facilities. And so that's a win, not as big a win as, yes, we're gonna close these facilities on this date, but at least we got the commitment from the governor's office not to create any new youth prisons. And so in 2019 and in January 2020, we released our formal bill, right, to the New Jersey legislature. It's called the New Jersey Youth Justice Transformation Act, which would introduce legislation that would completely revamp what we now see in New Jersey as our youth justice system. And so what it would do is formally end construction of future youth prisons. It will also place an investment of $100 million in communities for that continuum of care, and it will also close our existing youth prisons and provide young people with services to stabilize them in their communities. Unfortunately, as we began to get some traction on our Youth Justice Transformation Act, COVID-19 hit, right? And so we saw that there were budget considerations that had to be made because of the economic pitfalls that everyone experienced globally, right? But that the work didn't stop. So even though we couldn't push this really large bill, we started to do more targeted work. And so we saw that once again, New Jersey led in one of the worst ways with having the highest rate of young people and adults who were dying in jails and prisons due to COVID-19. And so due to that, we were able to do a 2-part bill where we got a public health emergency credit bill passed, which provided early release for incarcerated adults and young people. And so to date, we've gotten 100 young people released from jails and prisons in New Jersey under this act. And it's on a rolling basis. So whenever someone comes within 8 months of completing their sentence, they can be released home. And so that's still impacting young people already. At the time of the bill, the JJC had released 50 young people. 40 youth were already released before then, and then we've released another 50 since then. So that was one way that we had to shift our efforts to get young people out of prison due to COVID-19. But another thing that kind of came out of that was we were like, okay, it might be a while before we're able to get this full $100 million investment, but we can still chip away at the amount of money that we're spending to incarcerate young people. And so one of the things that we did was we got a group of people together across 6 cities, and the 6 cities where young people are predominantly being incarcerated. And we've got all the stakeholders together. We got those young people, we got their parents, their faith leaders, their teachers, the store owners. Everyone came together to talk about what's wrong with youth justice in New Jersey. And how can we build up a system to support our young people and move away from punitive measures? And one of the largest things that came out across all 6 sessions was that we don't do restorative justice well here in New Jersey. We are very punitive. We don't understand people's motivations. We don't understand what communities look like. And unfortunately, what that looks like is the over-incarceration of our young people. And so we were able to actually pull together a toolkit. It was called a Restorative Justice Toolkit, right? Where we literally laid out everything that you would need to know as a community member on how to build a restorative justice hub in your community. We gave you sample letters to invite people. We gave budgets. We gave a grant consideration, everything that you need, right? All the components, what those components look like, who should be at that table. And we released that toolkit. And that toolkit actually was turned into legislation. And that legislation is called, and please bear with me because it's a really long name, it's called the Restorative and Transformative Justice for Youth and Communities Pilot Program Bill. That's the first time I got it right in this one shot. So that really long name for that bill provides $8.4 million, which is about 20% of the operating budget for the JJC. It moves $8.4 million away from incarceration and towards restorative justice practices. So we're actually able to build up 4 hubs that will operate in a 2-year pilot program across 4 of the 6 cities where young people are coming from. And so what we're hoping to do, and this is a really big win because we moved 20% of the incarceration budget, but what we're hoping to do is that after this 2 years, position communities to have functioned really well, right, for these restorative justice hubs so that we can, 1, make it a statewide initiative where restorative justice hubs will operate statewide as an option for youth who are court involved or before they become court involved. But we're also hoping that this will make a considerable dent in what we are spending to incarcerate young people. So that's the 2-pronged kind of hopes for that pilot program bill, but I'm really excited about it because it's going to provide a lot of resources for young people. And not only is it just for young people who were previously system involved, it is for young people who have not been system involved, who are at risk. So they can come to this restorative justice hub for community conferencing. If there's a conflict in the community, you don't have to, unless of course there's violence and you need a police officer there present, but you don't have to call the police, right? You can make this referral to the Restorative Justice Hub so that young person who stole from your store, you can sit down across from them and we can talk about what's going on with you, right? What happened here? And then you can always, we also allow this process to give voice to the person who was impacted. So you can tell that young person, this is how, your action impacted me and my family or, my business. And they're able to understand a little bit more about how their actions impact the community as a whole. And then we talk restitution. What does that look like? Maybe restitution doesn't look like me sitting, in a jail for 6 months. Maybe it looks like me volunteering at your store for a while, right? Maybe it looks like me, going to doing a mentorship program. Maybe it looks something different. But at least both parties are here to understand the process, and we're hoping to loop in public safety officials in that process as well, so that's true community policing, right? We get to understand exactly the motivations of people in this community. We get to understand what they're going through. We need to understand why. And this is really important for advocates too, because if you see a lot of young people getting charged for robbery or theft or stuff like that, that there's room there to make improvements in your community structure, right? And that's where that transformative justice piece comes in. So this restorative justice, that this person-to-person rehabilitation is making space for large systems level change. right? And so that bill was actually passed and made into law in August of 2021. And we're currently working now with the JJC to get those regulations out there so that people can start submitting their RFPs. And last but not least, under our timeline, we do have, we did another kind of way, like how can we continue to move funds away, right? Because we were really so successful with the Restorative Justice Hub that we went into 11 areas. 11 areas in New Jersey. Sorry. We went into 11 areas in New Jersey and had a conversation. Oh, sorry, it's just moving by itself. Okay, we went into 11 areas in New Jersey and we had a conversation with people about mental health. Because nationally, we see that 70% of young people who enter into the criminal justice system have a mental health diagnosis that's either under or undiagnosed. And unfortunately, incarceration doesn't help that, right? You actually see an exacerbation of mental health issues when young people are incarcerated. So we understand that if 70% of young people are entering into the criminal justice system with a mental health diagnosis, then it may make sense for us not to invest in incarceration, but in front end mental health services, right? And so we talk to people about what are the barriers to mental health, both culturally, financially, infrastructure-wise. We wanted to know everything, right? And a lot of it was, well, we don't really have relationships with community mental health providers, right? And so what we had to do was have a conversation and say, okay, well, how can we increase that, right? How can we help mental health services in the community outreach to young people and their families in the community that need them? Also, we saw that people are like, my kid is seeking a social worker at school. He doesn't really need the rest of this. But the same way we look at academics and there's like summer programming to reduce the summer slide. When young people are having mental health services in school over the summer, when they don't have access to that, there's going to be a little bit of decline in any kind of progress that they made, right? And so we have to set up community-based structures that are going to support young people throughout this continuum. And so that just wasn't there. And so we released another toolkit over the summer that really talked about how community members can be engaged and empowered in this process to support young people on the mental health side before it reaches a space where they become incarcerated. And so this image right here is the continuum of care. And so these are all of the different things that we can invest in, right? And I'm sure this list is incomplete because I'm sure that if you guys look at this, you'll probably be like, well, you're missing this or you're missing that. But still, there's like 20 different things here, different programs on different levels of service, right? From prevention, pre-intervention, intervention, diversion, and out of home and aftercare. There's so many different things that we can invest in. However, this small blue circle right here that says secure out of home placement and aftercare services, that's a fancy way for incarceration. That's where all the money's going. So we have all these other options, right? Wraparound services, and intensive home intervention, affordable housing, green spaces, all of these things, right? That we have to invest in to stop our youth from being incarcerated, but all we're doing is placing all that money in a little circle. And so I love to use this image because it helps people kind of visualize how much we were failing as a state because, we have so many more options. Why are we relying on incarceration? And so reentry wraparound services is something that one of the restorative justice hubs is doing. And we're hoping that the reentry wraparound services will provide that smart decarceration model, right? How do we get people out of prison and back into the communities in a way that's healthy and sustainable, right? And so a lot of this we did with asset mapping, understanding what's in the community, how can they better talk to each other, right? And how can we build systems that provide a clear pathway for young people when they come out. And then our Restorative Justice Hub, I'm not going to go through this again, but this is pretty much what I was talking about, came out of our toolkit. And so phase 3 was when we talked about what we did with our mental health toolkit. And we're also releasing a cost of incarceration white paper report that talks about, like, we know the big number, right? 445,000 to incarcerate a single young person. But there are other intangible costs that we don't really think about, right? And New Jersey is one of those places where, like, you have to pay for your public defender. We don't think about those costs, right? How are families coming up with that? Or even if they do seek actual representation, right? How do they come up with that money? And we interview people, and we talk to lawyers, we talk to prosecutors, we talk to public defenders, we talk to incarcerated people, we talk to people who have been previously incarcerated. And what we're hearing is that people are borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today, right? People are sacrificing rent money. They're going into their 401ks, right? To talk about, to pay for all of this. And so we went into the community, and we're going to release that paper that's going to talk about some of those other intangible costs too, like the cost of potential, right? Lost potential, lost education opportunities. And then let's not even talk about the developmental side of it, right? Young people who go into an incarceration, a state of incarceration when they're too young, and they spend a significant amount of time there, are not going to ever be able to fully recoup those experiences, those developmental milestones once they come out. And that has significant implications for their employment opportunities and the way that they are able to generate money. And so that toolkit was kind of paired with the mental health toolkit, where we talk about also the mental and social emotional implications of incarceration as well. And so overall, we are continuing to advocate for the closure of youth prisons. We understand they do not work. They do not function in the way that they were intended to, or maybe they do function in the way that they were intended to, right? But we know that due to the severe disparity and the implications of incarceration for people's long-term health in New Jersey it's something that we need to stop and that we need to end. And so we always encourage people to follow these 10 advocacy tips, to keep up with the data, right? Understand the system. All of these things are readily accessible. So if there's anything that you ever want to, get into or understand about what's going on in New Jersey in your own state, all these things are readily accessible to you, right? Building relationships with people who are on the same page with you, building coalitions, finding common ground with other organizations and people gives you a larger voice, and it helps you to develop your strategies and your measures of success for whatever it is that you want to do, especially as it relates to closing youth prisons. And so we spend a lot of our time on the last three, where we are organizing and doing a lot of groundwork. Our theory of change at the Institute centers on community experience. We cannot begin to talk about policy until we understand how policy impacts people. Like, how do these issues show up on your doorstep? And so we do a lot of organizing, understanding the impact of these issues for people. And then we talk about we start to draft our policy proposals and our legislation, right? How do we want to change this? How can we make this better? And then we loop back around. After something goes into law, we come back on the community accountability part. We don't ever submit anything on behalf of people who were incarcerated without their voice, right? So we want to make sure that we're not doing any harm, that every policy, everything that goes into this work of closing youth prisons is reflective of the experiences of people who have been through it. And so that's pretty much where we are. And we are continuing now that we are, not that we can ever really be on the other half of COVID, but we're in a better place where we're dealing with it better. We're hoping to, in the next couple of months, release our closure plan for those prisons that we got announcements for, and also to just revitalize our New Jersey Youth Transformation Act, which will essentially close all youth prisons in New Jersey and give us that $100 million lockbox fund to invest in the community.
Thank you so much, Ashanti. So much happening in New Jersey, and so great to see that the momentum is carrying throughout the system, right? So folks are looking at keeping kids out of the system early on. Folks are looking at making sure foster youth have families and communities that they can rely on, and that we're closing these harmful youth prisons and for-profit facilities. So thank you. I am going to attempt to share my screen really quickly. So because it's Youth Justice Action Month, we did want to highlight ways that folks can really take action to make good on all these sort of theoretical changes that we are working on implementing in our communities. And so there's sort of three big actions that we hope folks will take away from today. So it's really making sure that we end abuse and neglect and exploitation in all of these facilities, right? From we know that residential treatment centers are house children who are both foster youth as well as kids in the youth justice system, and that abuse and neglect and exploitation are rampant in those facilities. So making sure we close those for all young people. And then really calling for an end for for-profit placements. We've heard from experts at NJJN as well as folks with the We Warn Them campaign about how there's so much lack of oversight at these facilities that it really just creates a breeding ground for really disastrous abuses. And so making sure we end that for-profit nature. And then really just shifting, right? Like we've talked all about the need to invest in families and communities. If we have healthy families and communities, we have healthy kids. And so making sure that we're not investing in institutions that perpetuate trauma, but really shifting those resources back into programs that we know work and sort of those options that we heard everybody talk about, right? There's so many options that we aren't funding. So I'm gonna try to reshare, I'll stop sharing my screen, but I'm gonna reshare the 3 actions that if you have a minute to do, you could please take one moment to sign the relative petitions that are supporting federal efforts on each of these things, as well as just learning more about the campaigns that we had these brilliant experts on from. So I'm gonna stop sharing, I'll drop those in the chat. We have like 10 minutes left. We were hoping to have more time for breakouts, but instead we're just gonna do questions and answers so that folks can get their questions answered. And I will say that one person already asked if we will share slides and presentations. So we'll be sure to share all of the presentations from today. We'll share the recording and as well as all the resources. So if you do have a question, I'm gonna do my best, but if you could either raise your hand or drop it in the chat, that might be easiest for me to monitor. We'd appreciate folks bringing forth any questions for our panelists. I will say too, you can also unmute yourselves if and jump in with a question.
I have a question if I can, and maybe a comment if I can make.
Please.
Sure. My name is Gabriel. I work with Jasmine, who also presented with the We Warn Them campaign. You know, one of the issues that I noticed is that perhaps maybe with, you know, we're seeing a lot of coalition building, and I think this is great, right? With these sort of activities. If we can start working on perhaps projects on to the media to really bring in awareness to the general public. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think that in certain circles, these issues sometimes they tend to be a little bit on the ground, right? Because the facilities are like everything happens behind closed, you know, doors, so to speak. To sort of bring it more forward. We noticed, for example, like in the state of Missouri, if I can use that, there was a girl who went on TikTok, right? And so those legislators, they just passed legislation, right, in Missouri that would never happen if it didn't get hit in the media. In Alabama, and there was someone who's speaking from that state, there was an issue with a boy named Lucas, right, who went to a facility, right? And the state was embarrassed. And so now the state then took action from there. And so really media, I think it's really one of the projects, and you know, our group will be willing to work with anybody on that to really expand how do we get the public really activated and aware. And we know that these kids, I'm also a survivor as well, so I can really relate. These are kids that no one really cares about. And so when we're talking about helping kids in general in society, somehow in that equation, we forget about the foster care systems. We forget about these kids who are in the juvenile system. And we also forget about these kids who are falling between the cracks. And so, and I think that this is what you guys all and all of us are doing, is really trying to bring that up. So, you know, it's sort of, I guess, a loose question or an idea. You know, perhaps maybe we can start talking in the future, how we can do collaborative, like really impacting with the media. It's getting the media, who doesn't like to really talk about these kids either, more engaged, so that the general public, so this is not this foreign subject that a lot of folks, you know, that's I live in New York City, and a lot of folks are just clueless about this stuff, right? And we're very liberal, whatever you want to call us. We're conscious, we're educated people, but somehow this information mixed the cracks. So that's my thoughts. And I'll just leave it like that, I guess. And I'll let someone else.
No, I really appreciate that. And just there was a couple of things that popped up for me as you were speaking, and then please, any of our panelists should feel free to jump in. But so also part of Youth Justice Action Month, we're hosting a media education series. And so we will be talking with different reporters and trying to get at this point that you talked about folks don't know who these kids are. Folks generally have assumptions about these children that are unfounded and untrue. And so trying to dispel a lot of the myths that we have around who these kids are and what they need. So that's sort of the focus of the first piece. And the second piece is really just sort of talking with reporters on how to cover these issues more broadly and get a multiple array of perspectives. And so would love to partner with all the folks on this call right around making sure that they're hearing from multiple voices about the need to better serve these young people. So I hear that. And Sarah, I know you dropped a comment in, but if you want to share it.
Bobby, I know you raised your hand. Do you want to go first?
I can. I need that mug that says, "Where's the mute button?" or "You're muted." Anyways, if anyone wants to send that for Christmas, much appreciated. Gabriel, I'm so glad that you brought up that point, because I think one of the biggest issues that we face as a country is the negative narrative around young people, everyone believes it, right? I can think of countless stories where I go into a store and someone's like, "Oh, those foster youth, they're trouble," right? And it's just kind of like, no, that's not the case at all, right? And so I think as a country, we just need to kind of band together with the ecosystem that we have and who has awareness around the issues, and really start to work to shift that negative narrative around the youth, because that's far from the case. And it takes a community, to raise a child. It takes a village to raise a child. And so we need to lean on our community and make sure that they're hearing that here is the actual narrative around youth, not the one that you've been told for so long. And then I'll pass it back to Sarah, because I'm sure she's going to allude to the event that is happening on Wednesday, which I hope you all can join.
Totally agree with what Bobby said. And yes, I just shared this in the chat, but what you said, Gabriel, is a part of what our goal at Think of Us has been as well, which is how can we actually make this a broader issue with more public consciousness around it. And one of our stabs at that is this Wednesday. Think of Us is hosting a virtual event, which I just sent the RSVP link to, Wednesday, the 20th at 6:15 p.m. Eastern, where we're trying to show, just like this event is, some of the bridges with other ecosystems. And so some members of Breaking Code Silence, as well as Paris Hilton, are joining us for an event, kind of drawing some of the connections between the troubled teen industry, which I know we heard about today, and then also institutionalization and foster care. And it's specifically about people sharing their stories, and Bobby will be on that panel. So invite folks to attend there. That's kind of part of our effort to contribute to what you just spoke about. We also recently, Sixto Cancel, our CEO, had a New York Times op-ed about institutionalization and foster care. And that was kind of one of our wins for breaking this out of some of its silos. So I just shared a link to that as well. But definitely hear the broader point, and we feel it too, of how do we bring more broad public attention.
Yeah, and folks are also sharing great comments in the chat. And so I know that folks are sharing other resources there. So thank you for that. I think we have time for maybe one more question. We've got 1 minute left. So if there's somebody else who wants to pop in with a question or drop it in the chat, please do. Just as a reminder, so this has been recorded. We will email it out. It'll take us a couple of days just to get it formatted and up on the web, but we'll get it up, share this, as well as all of these awesome resources that folks have put in the chat. Not seeing other questions unless I'm missing hands raised, and I apologize. It's hard to scroll through everybody. So with that, I think we'll close it out, but I do just want to end with a huge thank you to all of the presenters. You guys are incredible, and we really thank you for leading the work on all of these different areas and working to make sure young people are well-resourced and home in healthy situations. So thank you all, and we'll continue to work together to make sure that we can see a world where there's no kids in institutions. So thank you all and have a good day.